Sir Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Our relationship with Europe has run like a contentious thread through our politics for more than 60 years, and the referendum revealed a nation that remains divided. And though it pains me to say it, for the reasons I have to say so ably set out by the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rushcliffe in his speech, and I think the Foreign Secretary, who's no longer in his place, was shaking his head throughout because he probably didn't wish to be reminded of the arguments he put in the other article he chose not to publish back in June. Though it pains me to say it, we are leaving the European Union, and our task now is to try and bring people together. And that means that whether we voted leave or we voted remain, we have a responsibility to hold in our minds the views and the concerns of the hopes of everyone in this country, whether they voted leave or remain. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court, rightly in my view, decided that a decision of this magnitude should be taken by Parliament and not by the Executive. But with that power comes a responsibility to respect the outcome of the referendum, however much some of us may disagree with it. This is about democracy. It is about faith in our politics. Not just in the United Kingdom, but across the Western world, where, if we are honest with each other, it is not in very good shape. And if this Parliament were to say to the people, you didn't know what you were doing, you were only 37%, it was only advisory, there were lots of lies, whether one agrees or disagrees with some of those assertions, we really would have a crisis of confidence in our politics for the reasons so eloquently set out by my honourable and learned friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras. And that is why the democratic thing to do is to vote for this bill, as I shall do so tomorrow. But the referendum decided only one thing: the fact that we are leaving the institutions of the European Union. It did not determine the terms on which we leave. It did not decide the new relationship we will have with the other 27 member states. And that is why we have as a nation to get our objectives right and the process right as we start this great negotiation. And I have to say the government's handling of this thus far has not shown sufficient respect for Parliament, notwithstanding the number of times the Secretary of State has come to the dispatch box, because for several months ministers appeared to believe that saying, well, we're not going to give you a running commentary, and if you ask for greater clarity, in the words of the number 10 spokesperson, you are not backing the UK team, was the right way to approach it. It wasn't. At every single stage, the commitments that have eventually been given to set out objectives, to seek transitional arrangements, to publish a white paper, to confirm that Parliament will have a vote, by the way, all things that the Select Committee I have the honour to chair called for, far from being freely made, were reluctantly conceded, usually a day or two after the Secretary of State had resisted them from the dispatch box.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will.
I'm grateful. He refers to the fact that the government is now saying that there will be a vote on the eventual deal. I'm presuming that what the government means by that is that under the provisions of the 2010 Constitutional Reform Act, there will be a single vote on an unamendable motion in relation to a treaty. I don't think that's good enough. I think if the European Parliament, and for that matter, the Irish Dáil and the French Assemblée Nationale will have the right to consider a treaty line by line, this House should have the right to consider it line by line.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that the House must have a proper, and in the words of my front bench colleague, a meaningful opportunity to scrutinise the agreement in draft and not to be presented with a fait accompli at the end of the process. And this is one example of how at every stage the government has had to be pushed and cajoled and prodded into giving Parliament a proper role. And I do say to the Secretary of State, and it may not be his fault, it is extraordinary that we meet here today being asked tomorrow to vote for this bill when not a single government document has been published setting out the consequences. Not a single economic assessment, no analysis of the options, no white paper, 7 months after the British people reached their decision. And this is not the way to do things, and it's an attitude that has to change. The government needs to give much more recognition to Parliament's place not to be a bystander, but to be a participant in this, the most complex and significant negotiation this country has probably ever faced, because we have to unwind and recast 43 years of relationship with our neighbours. It affects every area of our national life, every part of the country, every person, every community, every business, the jobs, the incomes on which they depend. And therefore, it is essential that we have unity of purpose in trying to get the best deal for Britain, despite the inevitable uncertainty of the outcome. Now, we will come in committee and subsequently to the issues of substance. What does this special access to the single market mean now the Prime Minister's decided we're leaving it? How exactly does seeking to remain in the customs union and leave the customs union at one and the same time going to work? And I say to ministers, if it is their priority to ensure a continuation of tariff and barrier-free trade, if Europe comes back and says you can't have your cake and eat it, you've got to choose, I trust the government will choose in the end to remain in the customs union. How are we going to continue to cooperate with our neighbours at a time when the world is more uncertain at any time in the last 60 years on foreign policy, defence, security, the fight against terrorism? And the final point I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is this. This referendum result revealed something else. There are two great political forces in the Western world that are reflected in our politics. On the one hand, the desire that people have for greater devolution, for greater control in a world in which it seems to many people we barely have any control at all because of the pace of change in our world, in our lives. And on the other hand, the understanding that every single member of this House has, whether we voted Leave or Remain, that in the modern world we have to cooperate with our neighbours to deal with the great challenges that we face in the years and the centuries ahead. And leaving the European Union may change the balance between the two, but it is not going to change the necessity to embrace both as we look to the future.